Rutgers football loses its third straight game on Saturday to UCLA, 35-32. Two games in a row being home favorites in a year when Rutgers fans had high expectations, not only for the ceiling, but for the floor for this team. And I think that's where the real issue is, where this team is at this juncture of the season. 4-3 now, 1-3 in the Big Ten. Another extremely disappointing performance. And there's a lot to talk about here. I typically do a rapid reaction. There's a lot going on a Saturday with kids and with my family. And you know what? I just needed time to sit down and just address everything that I'm thinking after this loss. Just to give a little background, if you don't know who I am, I've literally been a Rutgers fan now for 40 years. 1984 is the first remembrance I have. I went to games earlier, but I was 7. 1984, they hired Dick Anderson from Penn State, longtime Joe Paterno assistant. I went 7-3. And I remember as a 7-year-old, my father worked there. I was around the university a lot. There was real hope that the program was taking the next step, that was going to be the catalyst for Dick Anderson to take the program to the next level. And if you're a longtime fan back in that era, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So my point is, we've lived through a lot of this, right? And they got to the Big East. They're going to be a big-time program. 90s were a disaster. When I went to Rutgers, they were 8-36, 96 to 2000. My senior year, they won one game. They beat Syracuse, the last-second field goal. Schiano arrives in 2001. Obviously, did wonders, turning the program around. We had 2006. And then when we all thought the program had a chance to take another step forward and be elite in the Big East for many years, they took a step back. Now, there was some real consistency there, a solid winning program that went to a bowl game every year, won a bowl game every year, more or less. And that was certainly an accomplishment. But there was a plateau. Schiano ultimately leaves for the pros. Kyle Flood comes in. We know what happens next. Rutgers joins the Big Ten. We have that great inaugural year, 8-5 and 14. 2015, all hell breaks loose. Kyle Flood, story for another day. Julie Herman, story for another day. And ultimately, Chris Ash comes in with Pat Hobbs. Another disaster era. I was at Rutgers in the Terry Shea area, and there's nothing been like it other than the Chris Ash era. So, just for context there, and where we are now, year 5 of Greg Schiano 2.0. He comes back under certainly some interesting times. So I normally do the rapid reaction. I don't listen to post-game before I do these, but Schiano made some noise in the post-game press conference today, telling critics to call their shot. Steve Politi, quote unquote, in his article, and I have the video up on my site as well. You call your shot, Schiano said after the 35-32 loss to the hapless Bruins. Just remember, we will get there. I promise you. So you want to call your shot now, just call it. But know that you're calling your shot. This program will be just fine. Thank you. All right. So as Politi wrote in his article, I was vocal about wanting Schiano back as well. And as were a lot of fans. There was a whole campaign that John Newman raised, $300,000, I believe, or such about that, for him to come back. There was a lot of support. In fact, the AD at the time was essentially nullified by the governor of New Jersey to bring Greg Schiano back. I was in that room, the opening press conference of Schiano's return, and he gave one of the greatest speeches I've ever seen. And he called for action for the entire state of New Jersey to have his back, to have the programs back, to unite and support. And he needed everybody to support this program, and that the goal was to win championships. Greg Schiano said that on his opening press conference. I was in the room. It was an inspiring moment. Fast forward to today, Schiano has a bit of a moment where he tells critics to call their shot. This is the reality of the situation. You're in year 5. Year 4, you show major progress. You break through. You get to a bowl game. You beat Miami in a bowl game, 7-6. You bring back the entirety of your starters that are eligible to return. This roster has over 40 seniors. This is billed as a developmental program. You're in the final cycle of development for the majority of your players and your starters. Now, there's a lot of things that have happened this season. Key one being injuries. And let me take a little side note here and say, because I got a little bit of criticism from some that comprehension, listening comprehension, reading comprehension is a little bit of a challenge. In interpreting my comments that injuries, I was saying it was an excuse. That's not what I was saying. Injuries have shown and proven there's a lack of depth on this team. And that is an indictment of the coaching staff. That is not an excuse. Injuries happen everywhere. UCLA had 2 of their top 3 receivers out today. Their availability report was as long as Rutgers today. In Wisconsin had a ton of players out last week. Both of those teams whooped Rutgers on the field, on their home field, in front of their home fans. Boos both games. Today, a lot of fans left at halftime. I'm not condoning that. I'm not condoning any of it. I'm just giving the reality of the situation. But the bottom line is, this is a developmental program. That's how you build your program. That's your brand, right? Keep chopping. Developmental program. We're not talking about 3rd and 4th string. We're talking about the 2 deep. And when key starters have gotten hurt, Rutgers hasn't had enough depth to survive it. Now, obviously, there has been more attrition than normal and a lot of key guys to that. In terms of today, we learned that Kenny Fletcher and Victor Konopka are out for the season, both tight ends. We know that Sam Brown, that was announced earlier this week, Brian Felter, and obviously Mo Toure before the season. So 5 key guys, 4 starters. In addition, Wesley Bailey and Aaron Lewis were both out today, both your edge rushers. Huge loss for the defense. In addition, you had 5 starters, 6 starters, if you count Jacob Anderson, the punter, but Eric Rogers and Robert Longerbeam, your starting corners, Kyle Monungai, who we'll talk about in a bit, and then Flip Dixon and Tyrone Powell, all listed as questionable. They all played, but they're obviously all dealing with something. If you go back to the week 1 availability report, where I think it's fair to question the fact that in that availability report for the first game of the season on Thursday, August 29th, you had 22 players listed on the availability report. You had Mo Toure out for the season. We knew that going in. He suffered not 1, 2 injuries in training camp. You had Flip Dixon, Wesley Bailey, 2 key defensive starters out for week 1. And you had Troy Rainey, who's been dealing with stuff all season, out as well. He's returned. He's in the rotation. And then on the questionable list, you had Eric Rogers, starting corner, Christian Dremel, who was leading receiver from last year, Deshaun Benjamin, who's a backup running back, but then Tyrone Powell, Keontae Hamilton, Tyler Needham, Aaron Lewis. 4 key starters, all listed as questionable. Earlier that week, Schiano had mentioned Sam Brown was dealing with something. That is in a capsule where the root of the problems, I think, began this year, is that you have had terrible health from the very beginning. Now, some of that's bad luck. It's football. It happens. But I think it's fair to at least point out that this team did not get to the starting line healthy. I don't know the ins and outs, right? I'm not being critical to anything specific other than as head coach, Schiano's old school, right? He's had success with teams that have overachieved. And going back to his first tenure, under recruited players that developed, overachieved, and the program took a step up. And there's a certain level of development that happens there, not just from a talent standpoint, but a physical standpoint, a mental standpoint, a belief standpoint. So as a coach, you have your ways, right? And your philosophies on how to develop that. So I understand that that's, coaches, all coaches, right? They're pretty stubborn. But you just have to wonder now, with so many starters being impacted all year with injuries, was there a possibility that this team went too hard too early? It's maybe some people will say it's unfair for me to question that. But if you look at how this team started to where they are now, this team has battled injuries throughout. And you've had multiple guys with multiple injuries throughout, or dealing with injuries the entire time, the same injury. Now, Kyle Monangai is an absolute warrior. He was playing with some issues today. He got hit really hard in that second quarter. I thought he was done. He comes back in the second half, and he delivers one of the guttiest performances, albeit in a losing effort, which is heartbreaking. But he delivered a tremendous effort in this loss. 3 touchdowns. He got them back in the game with a 30-yard run that ultimately he finished the drive on a touchdown. They got a field goal soon after, and it's a 3-point game. Now, the defense surrendered a touchdown soon after, but they continued to battle. And the one thing I do want to make clear is that this Rutgers team did not give up. Last week, the effort wasn't there. This week, it absolutely was, similarly to the loss in Nebraska. Now, that being said, while that should be clearly noted and appreciated, it isn't an accomplishment, right? Praising the team for not giving up in a season when expectations are high, that shouldn't be the baseline, right? Executing and playing winning football is the expectation. And this team, once again, it's crazy how these last 3 weeks, the first loss, Nebraska, the defense showed out, played great, offense, terrible. Next week, Wisconsin, nobody showed up, nobody played well, total brutal loss. This week, the offense delivers its best performance of the season, and the defense gets obliterated. I think it was 223 yards allowed after the catch, going against an offense that was 130th nationally in points, 132nd in yards. In terms of some of the stats here, UCLA had 478 total yards, 24 first downs, 7 of 13 on third down conversion, 1 of 1 on fourth down conversions, 6.9 yards per play, 2 of 2 on red zone trips. Had the ball for almost 35 minutes. Had several big plays. I mean, Ethan Garbers juked Igbenusin at one point. Igbenusin ran for 49 yards. You had Jones on a blown coverage, just blow by everybody. The linebackers were nowhere to be found. There were blown coverages, there were missed tackles all day. And the defense just was completely out of sorts. And it's just heartbreaking because the offense really showed up. You have to give Kirk Shiraka a lot of credit. You have to give Ethan Kaliakmanis a lot of credit. The play calling was a lot better. They made some adjustments. They did some different things than they've done. They started Christian Dremel. They used him in motion some. They moved Damir Miller around. Ian Strong looked healthier. That is definitely key. He's been battling some stuff. He had a big game. Some of the younger guys stepped up again. KJ Duff, most notably. Ben Black had a couple catches as well. And Kaliakmanis had real command of the offense today. and he played with confidence. He made some really good throws. He was 18 of 30, 287 yards, 60% completion rate. He did have one interception late in the game. That was a bad throw. But he certainly made some big throws in this game and kept Rutgers in the game. Monungai, absolute warrior, 19 carries, 106 yards, 5.6 yards per carry, 3 touchdowns. Kyle McManus had a couple good runs as well. Had a tush push. That was another adjustment at the goal line. They did the tush push finally. They stopped snapping it out of shotgun. So the offense really can't have any complaints. Scored 32 points. 32 points against a pretty bad team statistically. Now, UCLA had a really tough schedule. I didn't think they were as bad as the record. And I did want to touch on the two-point conversions that Rutgers failed. I don't actually the critics that Schiano made the wrong call, I actually disagree. I like that he went for the 2-point conversions. I think the real point that people are missing here is that Rutgers missed both. And I'm pretty sure they haven't converted a 2-point conversion all year. And I'm going to have to look that up now. But that is a big part of this. It's not always decision-making. It's a lack of execution on the field. And this team had a chance. Now, if they made, the adage was if they just kicked extra points, didn't go for the 2 points, they'd have a chance to tie the game late with a 2-point conversion. Sure. But if they converted the 2-point conversions, right, they'd be winning the game. So that, to me, is the bigger issue. Is not that they lost 35-32. Is that on that last touchdown, if they converted both 2-point conversions, they would have been up 1 point. That was the deal. And it would have been 35-35, and then they kicked the extra point to win 36-35. That's what I think people are missing. So that's not a criticism of Schiano, but that's a criticism of the execution of this team. And that was the biggest flaw for the offense today. Just trying to see real quick if I can find that stat. But overall, this was a just really frustrating performance from this team. And they weren't that competitive for a while. I mean, they gutted it back in, but they trailed early for a long time. The concerning thing now here is, people, it's not about expectations for the ceiling for this season. That's not what's important, right? And a lot of national critics jumped on the bandwagon and picked Rutgers. I mean, with the schedule, with so many starters back, the issue is the expectations of the floor. That is the problem here, because Rutgers is going to be challenged to meet those expectations now. And I think fairly, everyone felt that they were going to win at least 6, but really, I think the floor is 7 games going into this season based on what going 7-6 last year with everyone back with a much more manageable schedule. The thought was, okay, worst case scenario, Rutgers goes 7-5 into a bowl game. If they get to 7 wins now, they're going to do some serious turning around. That means they win 3 of the last 5. Now they're going to USC on short rest on Friday night. That's an unlikely win. It's possible, but it's unlikely. Then you go to that bye week. Hopefully you get a little healthier. You regroup. And then you have a manageable November, but not an easy November. Minnesota at home, at Maryland, Illinois at home, at Michigan State. Are they going to win 3 of those games? Maybe they could. Are they going to win 2 to get a bowl game? If they don't, if they have a losing season this year, unfortunately would be an abject failure. And that's completely on the coaching staff. Now, for Schiano to make those comments today, to call your shot, it's not a good thing, because maybe that's a rallying cry for his team. Maybe that's what he has to do. But if it is a rallying cry for your team, it's a plea of desperation, because that's not it, right? That's not it. If you need to say that to the media, to the fans, that's a negative connotation. And listen, like I said, almost everybody wanted Schiano back a second time. And there are certainly challenges that he has dealt with that were unforeseen and that are fair to count as real hard challenges for him to overcome. He got here right before the pandemic. NIL didn't exist yet. Transfer portal really hadn't taken off yet. The game has changed. Offenses have changed. They were changing already, but things are different now. And to reach the ceiling that he did with the program the first time, is he going to be able to do that the second time? And is that enough? Is that acceptable? This isn't me deciding. I'm just raising the question. And if you go 7-6 your fourth year, and then you take a step back your fifth year with essentially everyone back, regardless of the injuries, as a developmental program, you failed because we're not seeing the depth. And it's, he said the week before, well, when backups come in, backups aren't the starters for a reason because they're not as good as the starters. Well, that's really not a developmental program type message there. And there's certainly players that are playing right now that aren't playing well that I do think will ultimately be good players for this program. But the point is, with everything on this season, right? So much riding on the season, it just brings me back to the start. When you look at that availability report, 22 players, and could have something been done to prevent that? Did they go too hard at camp? And did it set them up for where we are now? Obviously, there's bad luck with injuries. But in terms of depth, it's not there. It's a failure in recruiting. We've seen, and it has, listen, there's always bad luck with recruiting. All the offensive linemen that have medically retired, impossible to know. And I've harped on this before. If you can't win in the trenches in this league, you can't win. But now you saw against UCLA, they didn't have the speed to contend. They didn't have the skill position speed defensively. They didn't have the speed defensively to match the skill positions of UCLA. And they ran all over them. They were spaced all day. And then to run over 200 yards after the catch. So many missed tackles, so many blown coverages. It was a mess. And when you're the head coach and your calling card is defense and your offense finally looked legit and puts up over 30 points and you still lose to the last place team in the league in year 5, in a year where the floor was a winning season, you can't get upset that people are criticizing you. And I think calling people out like that, it stinks. I think it stinks overall, just in terms of any other statistical things. Just going through the stats real quick. Demir Miller, 5 catches, 70 yards, had 7 targets, 12 yards after the catch. KJ Duff had that big 59-yard catch. That was great. 3 catches, 82 yards on 4 targets, 20 yards after the catch. Ian Strong, great to see him playing well. 3 catches, 71 yards, included a 42-yarder, 24 yards after the catch, 4 targets. Christian Dremel, 3 catches, 26 yards on 4 targets, 10 yards after the catch. Ben Black, he 2 catches, 16 yards on 4 targets. Chris Long, 1 catch, 18 yards on 3 targets. Monungai had a catch for 4 yards. Again, can't say enough about Kyle Monungai in this game. Also, Jay Patel, good for him, coming back, getting those field goals. 36 and a 49-yarder. It's great to see with the start he's had, with some confidence issues, with some miscues on special teams. He stepped up. And overall, those are kind of the highlights. I thought, again, Kalik Manish showed enough. He's not a top flight quarterback in this league, but he's good enough. And you've had some upgrades on offense. And the defense has been the big story, I think, the last 2 weeks. The offense, huge problem last week in Nebraska. So these 3 losses now, things are rolling downhill the wrong way. And goes back to the Nebraska game when I was so gutted because I just felt like the momentum had shifted and you left a winnable game on the table. And by the way, Nebraska gets slammed today by Indiana. First-year coach Kirk Cignetti. They're undefeated. Yes, he brought a lot of his own guys from JMU, FCS champ, but FCS, right? And now he's in the Big Ten. And he brought in other transfer portal guys. And yes, he demanded huge NIL, and he got it. And that is a big problem here. Rutgers doesn't have NIL to the point in which I think, your ceiling is going to be capped because of the level of NIL you have. It's not an excuse for where this team is right now. I don't think it is. But it's certainly a reason why, if you want to talk about a lack of depth with injuries, with recruiting, you also have to mention it with NIL in terms of the transfer portal. Rutgers isn't really in the game in terms of landing real impact transfers to fill that depth or to plug starting holes, and that's due to NIL. So that is part of it. Again, this isn't a just throw it all on Schiano, he's all to blame. There are a lot of factors here. But when you call people out like that, you got to look at yourself in the mirror. He said last week he's going to fix things. I respectfully was skeptical, and I said there's a lot of issues here I don't think are fixable in 1 week. And now you're really kind of spinning your wheels. And again, 4 weeks ago, you had one of the best environments in college football at home against Washington, got national raves. And now 3 weeks later, you're getting booed by your own fans, and the stadium was barely full when Rutgers almost came back in this game. And credit to them for almost coming back, but just too many mistakes. They're not losing on the field. It's not like their talent is that off. They're not losing to Michigan and Penn State. They're losing to UCLA. They're losing to Wisconsin in a down year. They're losing to a Nebraska team that is okay, is good. They're not great, and they're self-inflicted wounds. I mean, UCLA had 9 penalties today. They had one turnover, but the defense couldn't get any interceptions. But UCLA made mistakes, and Rutgers couldn't capitalize, and they made too many of their own. And UCLA just went up and down the field on them. And for a defensive coach, Joe Harris-Simiak too, he deserves, some criticism as well. And again, injuries have been a terrible thing, but you got to play the games, and you got to have enough depth to survive. And they don't. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and it's not an excuse. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it falls on the coaching staff. So Rutgers fans have a right to feel whatever they feel. I'm a huge believer in being vocal when things aren't going right, because as fans, we invest our lives in this. I mean, I said how long I've been a fan. There's been a lot of Rutgers fans longer than me. It doesn't matter if you've been a fan for 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, whatever long. If you're a Rutgers fan, you have a right to your opinion, and you have a right to vocalize that opinion. And that's what is important in this day and age. In the Twitter world, there's some bad things about social media, but some good things too. And guess what? Greg Schiano benefited from that in his return. In the way social media galvanized around him, was galvanized in rallying for him. So if people want to criticize him now and he's upset with that, well, it is what it is. And again, I'm not harping on the ceiling for the expectations for this team. I'm harping on the floor, because the floor is cracked and it's crumbling. And this team has a chance to fight back and salvage the year and still make a bowl game and possibly have a winning season, or it could completely fall apart. That's where we're at. So to question that is completely fair. It's also fair to question the future, right? Because if you have this year, if you don't make a bowl, then it's really going to hurt your recruiting message moving forward. And that's just the reality. And they have a great class in line for 25. And the staff's going to do everything they can to keep that class. And I hope they do. And I think they will keep the majority of the class. But future momentum, your developmental program, you need to show results this season. And they're just not there right now. I hope they are. If you want to say, I hope you eat your words later on, fine. I'll eat it. I'd be thrilled to eat those words. Because as we sit right now, things are not looking good. And the chances of Rutgers meeting their floor for this season are on shaky ground. Thanks so much for listening and watching here at the Scholar Faithful podcast once again.